The room snapped with static, and the air thinned, as if the walls forgot to breathe. Rhea Khan said, "Signal scrub complete," but her voice shook. She was a 32-year-old female signal analyst, and tonight the noise felt sentient. Monitors jittered, and the waveform leapt like a trapped thing. A voice cut through the hiss and said, "They're already here." Time folded around the sentence. Rhea whispered, "This is not a reflection." Director Vale said, "Kill the feed from a secure line that arrived too fast." Outside, sirens braided with the hum of distant traffic. The city listened without consent. The transmission bled patterns no human cipher could name, and yet it spoke. Rhea pressed her palm to the desk and felt the bench vibrate. The voice returned and said, "We have been waiting for you." The fluorescent lights stuttered like a Morse prayer. Rhea said, "Who is you?" And the room answered with another surge. Somewhere above, the building sighed like an animal that finally woke. The city wore the transmission like a fever that would not break. Rhea Khan said, "The carrier is not local," and her breath fog traced the shape of fear. Director Vale said, "You will route it to me only," and the line went dry. An ambulance drifted by without a siren, as if noise had become a superstition. In living rooms, the hiss swelled and stung like snow against bare skin. The voice threaded the hiss and said, "Listen, Rhea." She tasted copper and swallowed a name she would not say aloud. Rhea said, "You do not know me." And the clock on the wall blinked 12 in a loop. She built a wall of numbers around her heart, and the numbers failed. A child on a balcony asked a parent what that sound was, and no one answered. Rhea said, "This frequency feels like memory." The city exhaled through 1,000 vents, and none of it felt like air. The cover-up arrived with the smoothness of a practiced lie. Black vans took corners like thoughts already decided. Director Vale said, "Power down non-essential nodes," and the grid shivered. Rhea Khan said, "That will not stop the carrier." The voice seeped between silences and said, "We waited because you would hear us." A breaker clacked, and the lights throbbed dark, then bright. Rhea opened a notepad and wrote nothing because nothing felt safer. An intern asked if this was a drill, and no one replied. The building's spine moaned, and the floor found a new tilt. Rhea said, "It is not an invasion if they were never gone." The line rang back with hollow comfort and went still. Outside, streets filmed with rain and rumor. A market shutter rattled like a warning. Rhea Khan said, "Route the raw feed to a sandbox," and her thumbs danced across the keys. Director Vale said, "You will do nothing until I arrive." The voice said, "We asked for you by name." Rhea's pupils widened and shrank as if searching for a door. A vendor asked if the storm was real, and got no change. The radio tower on the hill glowed like a tooth in a giant jaw. Rhea said, "If I do nothing, it grows." She ran the sandbox, and the hiss unfolded like a map. For a heartbeat, the map showed home, and then it burned away. The shock landed a second time, and the room forgot yesterday. All clocks zeroed to a moment that had no name. The voice said, "Door open." Director Vale said, "Stand down." Rhea Khan said, "I cannot." Her palm hovered above the enter key like a blade. The city leaned toward the noise as if drawn by tide. Somewhere, a generator coughed and went quiet. Rhea said, "If you wanted fear, you chose poorly." The bench vibrated once more, and the transmission slipped a new tone under the old one. It sounded like a childhood song sung by a stranger. Rhea pressed the key and chose to hear. The world flinched and did not look away. Dawn crept over the city, while Rhea Khan counted the beats of a voice that was not hers. The apartment smelled of rain and old tea, and the hum lived inside the walls. Rhea Khan said, "I am fine," and the empty room answered with settled dust. Director Vale said, "You will rest and report at 9, and the call ended before her breath did. A photo of a 14-year-old male named Saif Khan watched from the shelf with a smile frozen in summer. Rhea Khan said, I still hear you, and she was not sure which you she meant. The transmission pulsed like a bruise under skin, and her hands shook less than her heart. She touched a paper crane her mother folded and felt the crease map of another life. The city throbbed below, and windows ticked with cooling glass and routine lies. Rhea Khan said, If I fear this, it rules me, and the fear blinked but stayed. She opened her notebook and wrote her name to prove she was still here. Memory arrived like a corridor lit by too many mistakes. The hospital had smelled of lemon and loss, and Rhea Khan had learned how quiet a heart can be. Amina Khan said, You cannot carry all of this, and her 58-year-old voice cracked. Rhea Khan said, I left for the exam, and I should have stayed, and the clock hands would not move. Saif had slept, and then not, and the room kept the shape of him. The nurse looked at the floor, as if truth lived there, and no one dared to step. Amina Khan said, You will make meaning or it will make you, and grief nodded like an old judge. The memory bled into the present with the same hiss as the signal. Rhea Khan said, I hear a pattern, and it is calling my name, and the fluorescent light trembled. She stood in her kitchen, and realized the kitchen was the corridor again. The world folded and did not apologize. The storage trunk held a history that pretended to be harmless. Rhea Khan flicked the brass latch and found letters that smelled of dust and ozone. Rhea Khan said, Who taught you this cipher, Baba? And the silence wore his shape. Director Vale said, Stand down until my team arrives, and the order felt thin. Her phone lit with Noor Aziz, and the word calling glowed like a dare. Noor Aziz said, You wanted a real story, and now it is pounding your door. Rhea Khan said, I want the truth without the ruin, and knew that wish was extinct. Between receipts and maps sat a radio badge etched with a call sign that matched the signal's spine. The past leaned forward and asked for rent she could not pay with sleep. Rhea Khan said, If my family touched this, I must know how deep, and the trunk waited like a mouth. The cemetery kept its promises under a sky, the color of unspoken things. Rhea Khan said, Saif, the voice knows me, and the wind moved like a hand she could not hold. The grass wet her knees and grief did the rest. The caretaker nodded once from far away, as if privacy were a right. Rhea Khan said, I was not brave then, and I am still learning, and the headstone listened. The signal softened in her mind until it sounded like a lullaby sung through wires. Director Vale said, You are not cleared to act alone, and the rule felt like a locked door. She placed the paper crane on the stone and watched it soak and give. Rhea Khan said, I choose use over fear, and the choice sat quiet and real. The city exhaled with her and the rain agreed to stop for one breath. Night returned and brought resolve with it like a blade in cloth. Rhea Khan cleared the desk and arranged tools with care that felt like prayer. Rhea Khan said, Record, and the mic caught the tremor and did not judge. She told the lens the facts and left out the parts that were only ache. Director Vale said, Report to me first, and she saved the message for the world anyway. The signal resumed its patient knocking and she began to map its pulse by hand. Rhea Khan said, If you are waiting, I will meet you on purpose, and the room held its breath. The city outside wore 1,000 lights like open eyes that would not blink. She marked a new call sign in the notebook and wrote it twice to make it stay. Rhea Khan said, I am not ready, but I am here, and readiness stepped closer. The archive room hummed like a throat clearing before a lie. Rhea Khan said, Cross-match the call sign with classified nets, and the console obliged with redacted ghosts. Director Vale said, You are operating beyond scope, and the ceiling vents sighed. The files showed timelines where human signals echoed before alien ones. Rhea Khan said, We answered first, and the cursor blinked, as if guilty. A memo dated years ago mapped outreach protocols to unnamed visitors. Director Vale said, Stand down, or I pull your clearance, and the lights held steady like watchers. The waveform from last night matched a buried drill labeled routine. Rhea Khan said, Routine is a good disguise for treason. and her heart kept pace with the fan. A shadow through frosted glass paused and then moved on. Rhea Khan said, "If this is real, the invasion is a continuation," and the room felt smaller. She copied fragments and swallowed the taste of metal hope. The underpass smelled of diesel and wet concrete, and the city listened with one ear. Noor Aziz said, "Your archive ping was traced," and her 34-year-old voice cut clean. Rhea Khan said, "By Vale or by whoever owns him," and a truck thundered above like a verdict. Noor tilted her head and studied Rhea as if measuring fracture lines. Rhea Khan said, "The drill predates contact and names, a call sign in my family." And the truth tasted like rust. Noor Aziz said, "Then your past is a key and a door." And the wind rearranged discarded flyers. Their breath fogged in short truce puffs under sodium lamps. Rhea Khan said, "There is a decommissioned site on the ridge," and the map on her phone glowed. Noor Aziz said, "We go now," and she slipped a recorder into her coat. Somewhere a camera blinked red and forgot to be discreet. Rhea stepped into the dark and did not wait to be brave. The decommissioned station crouched like a secret that learned to breathe. Rhea Khan said, "Power is supposed to be cut," and a faint fan replied with stubborn life. Noor Aziz said, "Dead things do not pay for electricity," and her smile did not reach her eyes. They moved through dust that remembered every footfall. Rhea Khan said, "This rack mirrors the drill memo," and she traced a cable path like a scar. A relay clicked and a spectrogram bloomed on a cracked screen. Director Vale said, "Exit immediately," and the speaker gave his voice a flat halo. Rhea Khan said, "You trained an answer years before a question," and her chest tightened. Noor Aziz said, "Record everything," and her hands were too steady. The station printed a strip of numbers that resolved into a surname. I del Jao, Dio Wadeji, Dio. Wah, I. Rhea Khan said, "Khan is the checksum," and the room tilted without moving. The first team arrived without sirens, and with choreography that felt rehearsed. Rhea Khan said, "Vale sent them or someone wore his name," and boots found their echoes on metal stairs. Noor Aziz said, "Left corridor," and her body turned before her voice was finished. They slipped through a service door that remembered oil and old storms. Rhea Khan said, "Why do you move like this is home?" And the question hung like heat. A stun round snapped past and stitched sparks across conduit. Noor Aziz said, "Because I learned to move where signals live," and her eyes stayed calculating. Rhea felt the station listening to itself with grim delight. Director Vale said, "Do not run," and the loudspeaker swallowed the nod. Rhea Khan said, "Running is how truth breathes," and the corridor narrowed. They hit the exit, and the night opened like a trap that preferred honesty. They found brief shelter on a rooftop that smelled of tar and waking birds. Rhea Khan said, "Tell me whose side you serve," and the question carried more wear than anger. Noor Aziz said, "You asked for truth," and she lifted her sleeve to reveal a faint lattice under skin. The pattern pulsed like a buried metronome keeping time with the signal. Rhea Khan said, "How long?" and her hands forgot their steadiness. Noor Aziz said, "Long enough to remember what you will not," and her face held both apology and task. Director Vale said, "Stand by for extraction," and the radio hissed like doubt. Noor Aziz said, "You think I do not remember," and the words were a key turning. Rhea Khan said, "You were my ally," and the rooftop leaned toward the street. Noor Aziz said, "I still am if you listen," and the sky decided to brighten. The betrayal arrived and sat beside loyalty, and both refused to move. The safe house smelled of solder and old coffee, while the walls bloomed with red thread maps. Noor Aziz said, "You chased a ghost and found a mirror," and her 34-year-old voice stayed steady. Rhea Khan said, "Show me the part where I am the lock," and her 32-year-old hands refused to tremble. Noor tapped a file labeled Parallax, and a cascade of memos stitched years into a noose. Director Vale said, "Return to command now," and the speaker cut before the threat could land. Noor Aziz said human cells keyed the first handshake, and the lattice under her skin glowed like a tide. Rhea Khan said, we invited them before we named them, and the truth arrived without mercy. A timeline proved that signals were trained like dogs long before the bark. Noor Aziz said, your surname appears as seed phrase, and silence made room for impact. Rhea Khan said, if my blood is a key, who forged the door, and the room held its breath. The vault opened like a throat, and offered a film that refused dust. Rhea Khan said, play, and a younger face filled the screen with careful grief. Arman Khan said, if you are watching, the protocol found you, and his 56-year-old features wore sleepless years. Noor Aziz said he speaks as architect, and the frame quivered like a nerve. Arman Khan said, your bloodline is why this is happening, and the word why hit like weather. Rhea Khan said, you made me a cipher, and the room discovered new corners. The video laid out a cadence that matched last night's signal with unforgiving precision. Arman Khan said, we bargained for time and gave them a door, and the door creaked in memory. Noor Aziz said, he coded you as checksum, and her voice was a measured blade. Rhea Khan said, then I am not a witness, I am a tool, and the light dimmed to agree. The briefing stream bled into the vault, like a vein found a shortcut. Director Vale said containment remains priority, and the men in suits nodded like metronomes. Rhea Khan said, he serves a choir, not a command, and the chorus wore national seals. Noor Aziz said, listen for the gaps, and the feed obliged with a silence shaped like guilt. Slides revealed contracts signed before the first reported sighting. Rhea Khan said, they built the welcome before the doorbell, and the air cooled. Director Vale said public narrative remains invasion, and the word remained bent the room. Noor Aziz said they fear the truth more than the unknown, and the fluorescent hum agreed. Rhea Khan said if they puppeteer both sides the war is theater, and theater felt expensive. The stream ended on a logo that looked like a verdict rendered in chrome. The inner chamber waited with a pedestal that remembered fingerprints. Rhea Khan said, this is the interface, and the device woke with a hush that felt personal. Noor Aziz said, bioacoustic handshake only, and the lattice under her skin dimmed in respect. A palm pad glowed with a pulse that matched Rhea's quiet fear. Rhea Khan said, if I touch it, I finish their sentence, and the sentence tasted like iron. Director Vale said, units inbound, and the walls measured distance in heartbeats. Noor Aziz said, we can set our own phrase, and hope entered with cautious shoes. Rhea Khan said, then we write a refusal, and the pad brightened like a vow. The device projected a spectral helix that twisted into her surname, and did not apologize. Rhea Khan said, I will not be a key for their lock, and the chamber listened. Sirens stayed distant, but purpose drew near with heavier steps. Rhea Khan said, we pivot from prey to author, and the words steadied her bones. Noor Aziz said, author means consequence, and her gaze held both warning and welcome. Rhea Khan said, my family built the door, I will choose who passes, and choice felt like oxygen. The device accepted a new cadence that bent the old shape without breaking it. Director Vale said open now or be erased, and the threat arrived late. Noor Aziz said broadcast a truth they cannot frame, and the plan assembled itself from need. Rhea Khan said I will expose the covenant and keep the channel, and a path cleared. The chamber lights rose as if the room wanted to witness a signature. Rhea Khan said, this is where the war stops pretending, and the future leaned closer. The city grid trembled as if listening for a verdict it already feared. Rhea Khan said, we push the cadence now, and the interface waited like a held breath. Noor Aziz said, if they mirror us we improvise, and her eyes tracked the spectrum's teeth. Director Vale said, stand by for containment, and the radio wore his patience thin. Rhea Khan said, containment is a story, not a cure, and her fingers hovered above consent. The alien carrier rose like a tide, drawn by a second moon. Noor Aziz said, "Anchor with your surname and pivot," and the lattice under her skin dimmed. Rhea Khan said, "Khan set, cadence bend," and the device answered with a low blue hum. Sirens braided with dawn birds, and neither one. The console printed a map of relays like veins on an exposed wrist. Rhea Khan said, "We name the lock, and we keep the door," and the room believed her for a breath. The strike team climbed the stairwell like a decision already made. Director Vale said, "I will not lose you to a machine," and his voice bled through 2 channels. Rhea Khan said, "I am not theirs or yours," and the truth did not flinch. Boots echoed nearer, and the hall lights flickered as if they wanted distance. Noor Aziz said, "By 6 seconds," and she slid a jammer across the table. Rhea Khan said, "6 will be enough," and her pulse agreed to the wager. Director Vale said, "Open the door," and the lock misheard him on purpose. A drone lens peered through the vent like a cold eye with perfect memory. Rhea Khan said, "If I broadcast, the lie dies," and the interface brightened. Noor Aziz said, "If you merge, you may not return," and the word may carried more weight than fear. The carrier split into harmonics that fit her name like teeth in a gear. Rhea Khan said, "I will not be consumed," and she fed the cadence a refusal shaped like home. The room dimmed, and then chose a steady courage. Noor Aziz said, "Ride the edge, not the core," and her hand steadied the encoder. Director Vale said, "Cut power now," and the building ignored him for the first time. Rhea Khan said, "Merge at boundary only," and the waveform wrapped her pulse without piercing it. The device unfolded a bridge drawn from her father's old math. Arman Khan said, "You will pay with self or with future," and the recording felt newly alive. Rhea Khan said, "I will pay with choice," and the bridge held. Outside, transformers sang an old hymn with new words. Noor Aziz said, "You are writing them back into history," and history made room. The grid flared and every billboard became a mirror that refused propaganda. Rhea Khan said, "Route to public nodes," and the cadence leapt like a spark across wet stone. Director Vale said, "You will collapse the city," and fear tried to rent space in her breath. Noor Aziz said, "Truth is a load, but lies are heavier," and the spectrum widened. The broadcast unspooled contracts and timestamps like a rain of iron filings. Rhea Khan said, "See who signed before first contact," and the streets answered with silence that learned to listen. The carrier surged and pressed against her like a tide against a pier. Noor Aziz said, "Hold boundary," and the boundary held by stubborn inches. Director Vale said, "I am pulling the plug," and the breaker clacked without conviction. Rhea Khan said, "If I fall, keep the channel open," and the city exhaled a long stunned breath. The carrier tried one last time to borrow her name, and she refused with both hands. Rhea Khan said, "I choose exposure over purity," and the words fit the room like a key that liked its lock. Director Vale said, "You cannot carry this and remain whole," and the warning sounded almost kind. Noor Aziz said, "Wholeness is a luxury for later," and she leaned into the signal with her lattice dimmed. Rhea Khan said, "Send," and every relay blinked like a city learning a new language. The device took a price in heat and memory, and left her standing. Sirens faded under a bloom of stunned quiet on 1,000 screens. Director Vale said, "I will protect you from the fallout," and the offer arrived late but real. Rhea Khan said, "Protect the channel," and the channel stayed. The night ended without asking permission, and the world refused to look away. The city woke like a patient after risky surgery, blinking at a sky scrubbed by rain. Screens in shop windows looped contracts and timestamps, and no one pretended not to see. Rhea Khan said, "The channel is stable," and her 32-year-old voice carried sand where water used to be. Noor Aziz said, "Your vitals are erratic," and the 34-year-old steadied the encoder like it could steady breath. Director Vale said, "You forced a reckoning," and his 50-year-old face on a screen looked older than policy. Rhea Khan said, I lost the smell of Saif's summer, and the admission landed like ash. Noor Aziz said, memory trades to pay the toll, and her eyes softened without losing their edge. Sirens wandered the distance without urgency, as if the sound had forgotten its job. Director Vale said, there will be inquiries, and the word inquiries meant walls and windows together. Rhea Khan said, let them ask, and her hands trembled until they did not. Outside, pigeons lifted in a slow gray wave and settled again because the world kept needing ordinary. Noon welded heat to concrete and arguments to air. Crowds stood in islands at intersections and read the same lines like scripture in a strange dialect. Rhea Khan said, they are choosing their sides, and she watched faces choose silence or speech. Noor Aziz said, truth is not a side, and the 34-year-old slipped a recorder into her coat. Director Vale said, we will convene an open panel, and the word open dragged weight behind it. A man with a child asked if aliens still mattered, now that humans did worse. Rhea Khan said, both matter, and her tone tried not to sound like a verdict. Shopkeepers turned televisions outward and took down the old headlines. Noor Aziz said, watch the quiet ones, and the quiet ones watched back. Director Vale said no arrests today, and the city took the promise like a loan. Rhea Khan said, I will not hide, and the street widened enough for one more step. Afternoon cooled in her mother's flat, and the kettle declared small victories. Amina Khan said, you look like you have been run through a storm, and the 58-year-old poured tea that remembered calm. Rhea Khan said, I told the world what Baba built, and the cups clicked like punctuation. Amina Khan said, he once said truth is a river that tolerates dams only for a while, and her eyes held a tired sun. Rhea Khan said, I paid with pieces of Saif, and the room bowed its head. Amina Khan said, your brother lived in new beginnings, and the sentence lifted like a window. News murmured from a small set and rolled names of officials who forgot how to deny. Rhea Khan said, Vale offers protection with conditions, and the word conditions tasted metallic. Amina Khan said, take shelter not orders, and her hand steadied her daughter's shaking tea. Rhea Khan said, I am still here, and the words rang truer than their shape. Outside, children kicked a ball that did not care about galaxies. The meeting happened in a museum closed for cleaning, where history wore glass and gloves. Director Vale said, the board once you disappeared, and honesty fit him like a borrowed coat. Rhea Khan said, protect the channel, and we both remain visible, and her 32-year-old face refused to lower its gaze. Noor Aziz said, we escrow the cadence with 3 public keys, and the plan clicked together like gears. Director Vale said, they will call this extortion, and the word they felt like a moving target. Rhea Khan said, call it insurance, and the fossils around them kept their counsel. A cleaner pushed a cart past and did not look, which felt like the bravest kindness. Director Vale said, I will divert the teams, and his voice looked for a bridge, and found a thin one. Noor Aziz said, if we are burned, the truth releases on schedule, and timing learned discipline. Rhea Khan said, we agree to witness, and the echo stayed soft but sure. The lights hummed a museum hum that honored fragile things and difficult air. Night carried a new quiet that never existed before the broadcast. Rhea Khan said, what did we save? And the city answered with distant traffic and shy stars. Noor Aziz said, we saved the choice to look, and her 34-year-old profile cut against the low glow. Director Vale said, my resignation was declined, and his voice over the radio held a humor that nearly healed. Rhea Khan said, keep the channel, and her hands rested without shaking. The lattice under Noor's skin pulsed once and then calmed like a sleeper deciding to trust. A drone crossed the sky and failed to feel threatening, which felt new. Rhea Khan said, Saif, I am learning how to be after, and the sentence found a home. Noor Aziz said, tomorrow we move the interface, and the plan sounded almost domestic. Director Vale said, you bought us time, and the word time finally meant seconds and not lies. The horizon exhaled a ribbon of pale gold, and the world agreed to continue. Morning thinned the night, and left edges that felt new, but not kind. The safe house wore silence like a careful suit, and the channel held. Rhea Khan said, "We move the interface to a neutral node," and she folded the map. Noor Aziz said, "We publish the escrow keys at noon," and her 34-year-old calm steadied the room. Director Vale said, "I can stall the board for 1 hour," and his 50-year-old voice carried grit. Rhea Khan said, "1 hour is enough to choose," and choice felt heavier than fear. Outside, the city learned how to speak in questions and not choke. The broadcast logs stacked like bricks, and made something that looked like shelter. Rhea Khan said, "If they cut power, the mesh reroutes through civic relays," and the mesh agreed. Noor Aziz said, "We will stand where the public can see," and visibility sounded like armor. Rhea Khan said, "If I am a key, I unlock truth and not a door for them," and the morning did not argue. The civic hall smelled of wood polish and nervous electricity, and every seat was full. Rhea Khan said, "We stream from here," and a murmur rolled like weather under the ceiling. Noor Aziz said, "We pin the escrow to 3 mirrors," and her fingers moved with surgeon care. Director Vale said, "Expect a blackout," and his warning wore a tired coat. The lights dipped and came back as if they changed their mind. Rhea Khan said, "If you see silence on your screen, hold," and holding became a practice. A protester shouted a blessing that sounded like a dare, and then sat. Noor Aziz said, "Upload begins," and the status bar pretended to crawl and then leapt. Director Vale said, "Units will keep the doors open," and the doors learned loyalty. Rhea Khan said, "I am not a weapon, I am a witness," and the hall listened because it wanted to. The first tremor in the spectrum arrived like thunder that forgot its voice. Noor Aziz said, "A new carrier rides the old path," and the graph grew teeth. Director Vale said, "Military bands request coordination," and the word request felt almost hopeful. Rhea Khan said, "Patch me to ground arrays," and duty found her spine. The sky above the hall flickered with a pale arc that looked like a curtain thinking. A field unit said, "Target is a high-altitude relay," and the relay pulsed like a heartbeat that wanted a different body. Rhea Khan said, "I will bend cadence without yielding identity," and the bend held. Noor Aziz said, "Boundary only," and her lattice dimmed to a steady ember. Director Vale said, "Authorizing synchronization," and the line steadied like a hand. The strongest node pushed back with a pressure that felt like grief, and then cracked where truth had weight. The counterwave rose from the arrays, and met the relay like a tide with purpose. Rhea Khan said, "Anchor on concede," and refuse command strings, and refusal became a craft. Noor Aziz said, "Mark the harmonic that steals memory," and her voice cut clean lines. Director Vale said, "Ground teams report lock," and the word lock finally belonged to them. The alien node flared and shed fragments like cold fire across blue noon. A pilot said, "Contact is losing coherence," and the plaza forgot how to breathe for 1 beat. Rhea Khan said, "Hold boundary and exhale on the downbeat," and the downbeat arrived like a friend. Noor Aziz said, "Release the public proof packet now," and proof ran like water downhill. The relay folded on itself and fell as light that became nothing anyone could own. Director Vale said, "Impact contained," and the day remembered how to be a day. Evening returned with a hush that felt heavier than victory and lighter than dread. The plaza emptied to leaves and wrappers and a long soft echo. Rhea Khan said, "The truth has a price," and the words tasted honest. Noor Aziz said, "You paid and you kept shape," and her 34-year-old hand steadied the case. Director Vale said, "The board will chase ghosts for months," and a smile tried his face, and almost won. Rhea Khan said, "We closed 1 door," and the spectrum answered with a distant, unfamiliar hum. Noor Aziz said, There are other relays far from this sky, and the air agreed without words. Rhea Khan said, then this is not an ending, and endings learned their limits. She walked away along the long line of shadow that belonged to her, and not to them. The stars kept their counsel, and the mesh whispered of a map that reached past home.